Hi, everybody. Welcome to our podcast and webinar all about AI in K-12. We have three incredible CEO guests with us today. We're going to give people just, a couple of minutes to trickle in as we do with these lunchtime webinars that everybody's on a different time zone. We'll start in about 2 minutes, but we have an amazing group, truly amazing group today. And what we're going to do, our agenda is we're just going to spend 5 minutes. I'm going to keep myself really tight on this. 5 minutes just talking a little bit about what Edtech Insiders has been doing to creating this generative AI map for the K-12 space. We have over 400 companies that we have identified in all sorts of different spaces with all sorts of different amazing use cases in education. We'll talk about that very briefly, but you're welcome to explore that product and map on your own time. And then we'll get into the conversation about some of the trends we're seeing, the breakthroughs, and what we might expect to see in 2025 as the space just continues to explode. So here we are at 12:02. I think I'm going to start kicking off with a few intros. People will keep coming in, but I'm going to ask each of our panelists today, or our guests today, to introduce themselves. They all have incredible backgrounds in EdTech and are all doing really meaningful and they're real change makers in the EdTech space for AI. I'm going to start with the incredible Adeel Khan, founder and CEO of MagicSchool AI, one of the true trailblazers in AI Gen AI education. Adeel, can you give us a little bit of a bio of yourself and what MagicSchool does?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Alex, and it's great to be on this panel with Ben and Bethany. My name's Adeel Khan. I'm the founder of MagicSchool, a generative AI product for K-12 schools. MagicSchool is used in over 4 million, or by over 4 million educators all over the world now. My background is as an educator. I was a teacher and a principal for my whole career before founding MagicSchool, and it has been an inspiring journey to see how educators are using AI responsibly, to give them superpowers in their work, in addition to using it with their students to drive outcomes and help them understand this new crazy technology that is affecting all of us all over in every industry. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me pass it to Ben Caulfield. He's calling in from Europe. They are doing incredible work with Eedi about misconceptions in math and really going deep in pedagogy. So Ben, give us an introduction to yourself and what you're doing with Eedi.
Thanks, Alex. Just repeating Adeel's work there. Great to be on this panel with Adeel and Bethany as well, who I know well. Yeah, briefly, I guess we're an AI lab. We build solutions for clients using cutting-edge machine learning models that power predictive assessment. As Alex said, we've had a decade's experience about trying to understand misconceptions, and it's through that data that we've been able to build these kind of product lines.
Yeah. And one thing that is really exciting about this panel is people are coming in from very sort of different angles on the EdTech space. And Ben is looking at math. He's looking at the really deep pedagogy and how we can use AI to make sense of these vast data sets. Bethany comes to the EdTech space from deep AI technology. She has a long history of AI expertise. Bethany, tell us about your background and what you're doing with Atypical.
Guys, it's really simple. I just like long walks on the beach and science fiction. And in my spare time, yeah, look, Atypical is what we say like a end-to-end AI like infrastructure platform for education. The idea being that you don't want to have to rebuild the same stack in order to deliver really high quality, high pedagogy, and like cost-effective experiences. So we work with some of the biggest publishers and universities in the world to bring textbooks, exams, and all this stuff to life. I also have a side hustle where I'm a fellow and researcher at Stanford, focusing on human-centered artificial intelligence, which is fun.
Yeah, it's a exciting side hustle right at the center of where things are happening in AI. All right, so I'm going to just take my privilege for just a couple of minutes here to talk a little bit about what we've been doing with generative AI at Edtech Insiders. This space has been moving so fast since, late 2022, I believe it was, right? We're 2022 now, 2023, I think 2022. When we first saw this sort of generative AI boom, we've just seen incredible numbers of of companies and people starting to make sense, starting to jump in with educational use cases. And we worked with Lawrence Holt, who is a former chief product officer at Amplify and sort of a big man about town, a deep thinker in the ed tech space, to create, he had basically created this incredible taxonomy of educational use cases. And we worked with him to sort of categorize it to, we basically thought about 60 different use cases. I know that sounds like a lot, but there's a lot of things we do in education. 60 different use cases of ways in which AI can make a major difference for classroom usage, especially in K-12. And that can include both on the student side, it can include on the teacher side, and it can include actually the creation of instructional materials from any kind, from learner or educator. These 60 use cases, then we took over 400 companies and started to map and said, we started with the use cases and said, you know, what are people really trying to do? They're trying to engage students with multimodal instruction. They're trying to assess and give feedback. They're trying to create lesson plans. They're trying to do tutoring in an enhanced way. We started mapping them all together, and we just put out our sort of second version with the generous help of the Overdeck Family Foundation of this overall market map. And we have this sort of main market map here, which covers all 60 use cases. We have also recently put out a database that's searchable. If you go into edtechinsiders.ai, you can actually look at any of these companies. You can see the founders, and you can go to their LinkedIn pages. You can see this, you can link to the tools themselves and see what they're doing, see a description of them, even see the funding behind them, and a little bit of the reach, a little bit of just if they're scaled or they're a small startup, things like that. This is just the beginning. This is a huge and fast-moving space. We're really excited to be, you know, starting to chronicle it and looking for all sorts of partners. We're actually about to announce a research partnership, you know, within the next week. The last thing we wanted to announce here is that we're just now putting out deep dive maps for each of our 6 categories. There are a couple that are combined. So, you know, there's so many amazing companies, there's so many amazing people in this space. We felt like we only scratched the surface with a high-level market map. So now we're putting out deep dive market maps that try to be as comprehensive as possible, really show people, you know, as everybody that we have found so far working in the space. And on the site, we also have, you know, places for people to come in and tell us what we've missed, because we know this moves very quickly. We're trying to be as expansive as possible. We're trying to be international as well. So if you have a tool here and you don't see yourself on the map, please enter that in the suggestions box. And we take it very seriously. We do updates. We're planning on doing updates 3 times a year of these maps. It's an incredible space. It was so much fun doing the research for this. It's incredible how much is happening. And these 3 CEOs we have here today are amazing examples of people who are being very, very thoughtful in how they develop their AI and tech tools. So that was my 10 minutes, I guess. I want to jump into the conversation. So I'm going to stop sharing slides here. And Sarah, if you wouldn't mind trying to pin everybody if we are not yet pinned. And we're going to start talking in depth about some of this stuff. So the first thing I want to talk about today, because this is sort of an underlying element of almost every use case we see, is the role of data in this AI age. You know, AI is really data crunching. That's really what it is at heart. It synthesizes and makes sense of data. People may quibble with that, but that's really kind of what it does. So Ben, I want to start with you. I mean, you are doing incredibly interesting things with student data. So my question for you is, how does Eedi use new forms of student data and, you know, aggregating data, personalizing use cases with data, and what do you see as the role of data in this AI age? How do you see the sort of making sense of the vast amounts of data that we have as educators?
Thanks for the question. So I guess I'll split this up into 2. So kind of what we do, and then the role of data more generally. So as I mentioned, we build solutions for clients using this cutting edge machine learning models that power predictive assessment. What does that mean? It means that from just 10 questions, we can predict performance with a high level of accuracy against 10,000 mathematical skills. At slightly less accuracy, we could predict why those misconceptions exist. So not just the gap in knowledge, but why do they exist and what's actually holding them back. So we can think about the class view. So we can assess the 30 kids in the class and provide that insight to the teacher at that high level. And we can also dig down to that kind of personalized level as well. So for the global south, the former is probably better. For somewhere like the US, where devices are more prevalent, we can provide that insight at that individual level. So what we tend to do is work with partners with existing scale, and we provide these insights via an API. We don't need to know who the student is. That stays with the client, so the privacy is protected. So that's kind of like how we sort of think about the student data, the difference between aggregate and personal. In terms of like the role of data, I think what's been really interesting with not just advances in generative AI, but just AI more generally, is it provides more scope to be granular. So rather than topics, we can talk about constructs or skills. Rather than identifying gaps in knowledge, we can now talk about why they exist. And the AI sort of allows us to find those really complex patterns. But the quality of data is so important. You need really good, clean data. Errors in that data will provide poor inferences. You can't get away with poor labeling. You need domain experts in the loop. And we need things like understanding how the students are answering those questions, i.e., do they truly hold the misconception, or is it a mistake or a slip? So I think that's how we think about the role of data in as we sort of advance to more these kind of more advanced AI models and things.
Yeah, and you're touching on some of the core issues that I think are across the entire ecosystem right now. You mentioned, in passing, the data privacy situation. That is something that everybody is trying to navigate, at every level, is what data has to be protected, what student information has to be protected, and what should be used as part of this, incredible, crunching and synthesizing and finding of patterns. And then the other, of course, is this concept of, I don't know if you use the word entirely, but personalization, precision,
Yep.
helping figure out exactly where each student is at among these 10,000 mathematical skills. I didn't know there were 10,000 mathematical skills, but that's the kind of thing that AI can help you identify. So Bethanie, let me pass it to you with that. Atypical has data science really at the core of what it does. Tell us about what Atypical does and how you see that future of how data may start to create this vision we've all had for generations now of being able to personalize, customize education to every learner.
Sure. I think I'll speak kind of like broadly because I don't want to, I hate talking too much about atypical on these things. But there's a lot in the name atypical, right? We think about personalization as like a user-centered model that builds out versus trying to take like existing norms and then categorize people top down. And that's just like how we do our machine learning and our user modeling. But what I see is, and what I hope to see in terms of personalization is more an understanding of personal progress over some sort of like, norm, versus a norm, and like, giving people a rating of their own learning momentum. I was lucky enough to do Steiner or Waldorf schools the whole way through, and that's what we got. We got these really high touch, like, here's how you are progressing as a human against like put your personal best. So for sure, AI like enables this like richer, more holistic view of like what a learner can do. And it shouldn't just be like time on task anymore. It should be about curiosity, persistence, grit, and like cognitive flexibility. So if you're still measuring the old stuff, you should really start measuring like the new stuff. And that's what the best teachers and tutors are already doing. So we should just kind of like normalize that. But I think the big issue with personalization is that it must coincide with what I call orchestration. Like teachers are going nuts with all these like over personalized learning paths, and it's really hard for them to put it back together and find a way to facilitate learning with all of these different needs. So we call that orchestration, right? And there is absolute power in AI to be able to take these disparate like learning needs and bring it back into like an instruction whole and a daily plan that like actually allows people to pair correctly and the right misconceptions to be retaught. But if you don't have it, you're just going to be like driving people crazy at a certain level. Like this is what I hear from teachers. And I'll just end by saying like personal cognitive extension, you can call that like a digital twin, is going to become the norm. Like you're already seeing this beginning to happen, but these agents will have like real power, right? And, they will have real power and they will have rights and probably liability going forward. So when we think about personalization, just realize that that's happening in your students' lives in other places and think about like incorporating that into your pedagogy, your instruction, and just like the reality of everyday life.
Say that phrase one more time. Personal extension. That was
Cognitive extension. Yeah, there's like a whole, I get a bit nerdy on this stuff. So like this is a whole research area around how humans want to extend their own intelligence. But
Hmm.
we're starting to see products come out, right? We're starting to see operator and we're starting to see projects and we're starting to see these agents that are deeply personalized and that allow people to talk to themselves or create a mirror or, you know, take action on behalf of somebody else. So I could see in the near future a student being like, yeah, I tuned up this agent and this agent helped me with my homework in a dialogic Socratic fashion. You're telling me that's wrong? And I'd say in some instances that's really right, as long as the teacher understands and like, yeah. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
That makes a ton of sense. And one thing that was really interesting as we were looking at the different use cases and all the different, players in this space is that people who are doing things for students, for learners, are starting to touch on these really exciting sort of slightly sci-fi feeling, ideas like that, like seeing your own learning momentum, being able to, have a digital twin or other kinds of support that can sort of transform information, do all sorts of things. People who work within the existing education space are doing just as incredible things, but they look kind of different because they're working within a structure. You heard Ben talk about how they're very careful with their data privacy. MagicSchool is, as Adeel mentioned, has 4 million teachers and learners on the space. It started as a suite of teacher tools, expanded very quickly as a suite of teacher tools, and now also has student tools as well. Adeel, tell us a little bit about what MagicSchool has done to sort of become a leader in this space and what you see the role of data as. And just building on Bethanie's comment, do you see a time in which in-class tool suites may include things like digital twins, or is that just still the age of sci-fi?
Yeah, super interesting thought brought up by Bethany, and like I think really fun discussion to have, and interesting look into the future. So yeah, MagicSchool, like you mentioned, is used by over 4.5 million educators. Actually, students are not even in that number. So like
There you go.
our student product is growing like wildfire as well, but like in order to get to that number, it means that you kind of have to like be permissioned in schools, right? Like it is really, really difficult to have a product that goes into K-12 schools for good reason. They're really, really stringent, strict laws that are often fragmented state by state around student data privacy in general. A lot of the folks who are decision makers in school districts are also the data privacy officer. This is something that like folks who are maybe new to building in this space, I know is a lot of the audience here, is that if you're looking to access K-12 schools, that person that you're also trying to maybe get a contract signed with or get your product piloted with, they're also the second part of their job is also being the data privacy officer. So they
Oh,
are
yeah.
front of mind. Like, how are you protecting our students' data? How are you, aligned to the laws in my state? Can you comply with our school district's data privacy agreement? So when we started as a product that was directly focused on K-12 schools, we knew this was super important. So all of our data privacy documentation is available publicly online. Anyone can search it. We have a really robust privacy page. And we just kind of open source all of the ways that we do things, all the ways that we handle data. And I think that was a really important early decision that we made, investing tons of dollars and tons of energy and effort into making sure that those were kind of airtight and things that someone who's also, potentially our buyer, but also the data privacy officer would look at, and it would bring them confidence in our platform and comfort in our platform. Because even if they weren't ready to be a buyer or partner for MagicSchool, we do, and we will always have a really robust free version of the platform. So we wanted you to get acquainted with our free version and really, really love it. And when it's time where you might want to take the next step of being a district partner, you're already familiar and comfortable and know that we're really thinking about safety. So that's been a big part of our story, and certainly the reason why we've been able to be permissioned in so many districts. Early in this journey, and when you're talking about like late 2022, early 2023, school districts just banned everything.
Yeah.
So like, we have a .ai domain name, and that was an easy thing to ban. It was just like, okay, .ai, we're just gonna filter this, and it's gonna be gone. So we had to like work actively to get through permissions and school districts. But I mean, it's been certainly an enormous part of our story, and one of the reasons we continue to get the distribution that we get. And I think the fact that we are so transparent brings confidence in school and district partners, leaders, in addition to teachers. Second, to your next question, I think the idea of cognitive extension is already alive and well in MagicSchool. Like we have a tool on our platform. I always use this as an example of amplifying the intelligence of the educator. We're very much, we think, teachers are magic is a slogan, but it's also the ethos of our company. We think that teachers are the most important ingredient in the educational process, and AI can amplify the teacher's ability to support students. So, we have a tool on our MagicSchool for Students platform. All of the way that students interact with the platform is through a teacher launching an experience to students, and then the students logging in. So the teacher has to create, customize, and then launch, and then they can monitor all the things that the students are doing. There's a tool called the Writing Feedback Tool that's a really good example of like the cognitive extension idea. So the teacher will, maybe through a self-created rubric that they have, or the state assessment writing rubric, they will attach that rubric to the tool as something that informs the tool of, hey, this is what I want you to look at, and this is the way you should assess the student's writing. And then they put in their own intelligence. They say, we've been focusing on these 2 rows in the rubric, and this is the way I've been teaching it. So look a little bit closer for this. To me, that's a real extension of like the teacher's ability to impact learning in the classroom. They launched that tool to students. For me as an English teacher, I had 160 students in high school through 5 periods that I taught. There was no way I could give formative feedback to 160 students before they turned their essay in. Now, through that MagicSchool tool, I could program this AI tool with all of my knowledge, all the things that we've been working on, and then say, give students formative feedback before they turn their essay in. The students get areas of strength, areas of growth, aligned to the rubric, aligned to my desires of what their feedback should look like. I can test it, make sure it looks the way I would hope it would look. And that results in better essays turned into me, which means that like I'm not having to grade students who are way on different ends of the spectrum. The student gets a better grade because they had an opportunity to edit their essay and improve it before they turned in. And it's just a win-win for the entire system. Parents are happy. So I think that like these cognitive extension ideas will become more mainstream, but like to me, that's a really concrete example that's super compelling, that really hard to argue that that's helpful to students. Let's not have AI write, a student's essay, but let's have AI maybe give them just-in-time feedback before they get their human feedback from their teacher.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're honing in on something really important in the school use case, which is that you have an educator in, the loop, so to speak. You have educators being part of the process. They are designing the MagicSchool tools that are being given to students. They're saying what they're learning, what the standards are, what the feedback is. They can, the AI can even train itself on the teacher's feedback. So, and that use case is not as true when it's a learner trying to learn individually with a study tool or something like that. But I think it's really interesting hearing you both talk about this cognitive extension. A learner can extend themselves, make a twin, make a tutor. A teacher can extend themselves and make more of themselves, make a sort of Uber teacher who can give feedback in their voice in many different ways, make videos even of themselves that can go all over the world. It's a really crazy time in terms of what AI can do to extend our intelligences, as you both said. One of the things that's really unique about education as a space, I mean, obviously AI is changing everything. Even agentic AI that like Bethanie mentioned is starting to really change many different fields. But in education, we have pedagogy, right? We have a sort of science of learning that much of it lives in these journals. Some people pull out different ideas of it. There's obviously lots of teacher professional development and teacher training, but there's so much we know about the brain, and lots of things we don't know about the brain that are not used every day by either learners or educators. And I think one really interesting thing that AI can do at this moment is actually elevate pedagogy as part of what happens in AI products. And I think all of you think about this a lot. So I want to talk it through with all of you. Let's start with you, Bethanie, because Bethanie, you have lots of different users in your for your product, and you feature this concept of, I think you call it learning science-driven AI. It's literally AI trained to use retrieval practice, to use metacognition, to use some of the techniques we know work from the research. Tell us about how you do that and what you think the role of pedagogy is going to be in AI products in the future.
Let's see. Well, I'll start by saying I think that scaling pedagogy in software is this like emerging art, right? And we have a lot of it, you know, in the lab, but like actually seeing how it works at scale is, you know, frankly, in some ways like a new field. But you know, broadly speaking, I would say the best use of AI, I believe, is to mediate two or more humans, right? I don't think that like telling a teacher what their pedagogy should be is necessarily the most effective use. You know, what we see is that, for example, when AI is mediating or listening to a bidirectional or conversation between like a student and a teacher, it's able to like provide reflection and mirroring that helps both users understand how they're acting as a student and as a teacher that's trying to disseminate pedagogy. Um, and that has seen like huge impact, especially on teachers. Dora Dembski has done a bunch of really fun work, you know, at Stanford on this. So you can set this up with like two humans and have AI like mediate and then give them feedback, or you can do an agent and a human, or you can frankly do like multiple agents, and that's just like a way to kind of refine pedagogy in a system. So there's like a direct layer of like, hey, you know, sure, you know, a certain type of feedback, do you know, spaced repetition or whatever. But then there's this meta layer of enhancement, which is like this mirroring, which I think is incredibly powerful. You know, right now, like AI tools often assess like the correctness of answers, but like, you know, assessing how students get there, you know, and therefore adjusting pedagogy is really powerful. I spent a bunch of
Yes.
time at Google AI, and we were looking at how students um, like solve problems using digital ink, right? And we were looking at like what they did in the margins and like how they expressed frustration, or like what the worked product was in order to get to the answer. And so that isn't specifically like generative AI, that's like machine learning, but the combination of these things to understand like worked progress and get both the process of teaching, the process of learning, you know, into an environment where AI can help understand it is where I see the best pedagogical gains.
Yeah, you're naming two areas that I think are really fascinating and a little bit nascent, but incredibly powerful. One is the sort of social tools, like you're saying, you know, support for human tutoring or AI to facilitate group instruction. We have these on the market map, but not very many companies have really gotten into them yet, just because they're so new and everybody's figuring it out. And the other is this idea of uh, how do you use AI to I didn't put this. Um, yeah, I'll come back around to it. But you're talking about things that are coming but are not yet fully here, but they're really, really exciting in terms of bringing the pedagogy to life. Let me go to you, Adeel. I'll come back to this, but Adeel, you are a former principal. You've invested in helping educators put theory into practice for many years. As Bethanie just mentioned, you know, nobody wants AI to be telling teachers how to teach. That's like not the goal for anybody. But um, the idea of highlighting and elevating educational research best practices, starting to be able to make sense of the vast, you know, 100 years of educational literature and apply it to your particular use case, that feels very new. How do you think about pedagogy and in the MagicSchool suite of tools?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, one thing that I take a lot of pride in, like, you know, as an educator myself, like, you know, research-based best practices are things that, you know, we want to make sure that we are helping to distribute through our platform. And when I uh, when I started the platform, I remember thinking that the greatest compliment that we could get on it would be that people who are educators in the field saw it and were like, "There's no way someone could build this if they were not an educator and didn't know our jobs." So when I hear that, and I still hear that like to this day sometimes, I'm like, it really brings me a lot of joy, because, you know, educators have really technical jobs, and there's a lot of unique things that they do that only an educator in the field would really know. So I think that part of the superpower of our company has been that I spent a lifetime in education. I was a special education teacher, a history teacher, an English teacher. I even taught summer school math. I probably held every assistant principal job before I became a principal. So a lot of the use cases that are on the platform are very much from my own experience in the work and like in the workforce, but also it's now really become a voice of an entire community of educators. So I'm not arrogant enough to believe I know everything, and we one thing about having a really large user base is that they will always give us feedback. They will always tell us what's right, what's wrong, how this could be better aligned to the research, or research that changes over time. Like
Right.
there as an English teacher, I would hear things, and special education teacher, it's like, there was a era of we need to level text perfectly for every single kid. And then we were like, oh, maybe we're over leveling text and we are not challenging students to the next level of text. So, research can change over time too. So like staying in tune with those things and having school district partners help us understand those things, as well as a community of educators help us understand those things, is really helpful. And then the second part is making sure that we, so like that's kind of for the default, right? The default, we want to be really good for any user who signs into the platform. But now we're starting to hand over a lot of the reins to the local school and district, who ascribe typically to their own educational philosophies, their own priorities. When I was a principal at several different school districts, there would be we're focusing on close reading right now. So let's like really zoom in on this philosophy of close reading. And now you can do things like using RAG technology, attach those large philosophies of how we're going to be teaching this year to the tools. So the tools themselves can be informed by the single source of truth documents that the district ascribes to. So, that might be a little bit different school to school, district to district. And we want to put that in the hands of the educator, because we know one size fits all isn't the way that education works. And we're excited to give that to our partners as well as to users, so that they can make it really their own. And that's the beauty of AI, is it's so flexible and it can really become a new use case, kind of like through a teacher's use of it. Not to take up too much time, but I'll give you like a really interesting use case that came up through like one of our new tools that uses the RAG technology.
Yeah. Actually, can you unpack what RAG is for people who may not know that acronym?
Yeah, so RAG means retrieval augmented generation. Basically, what RAG does is it allows you to attach massive files to an AI to inform it, and it uses vector search to chunk the document into searchable chunks that the AI can be informed with. When it comes with a typical kind of like what you'd expect from an LLM, it allows it to be aligned to the document that's informing the tool. So, someone was using a pedagogical or a strategy for their instructional coaches in the district. So the instructional coaches have a philosophy they're ascribing to how they're coaching their teachers. I believe the book that they're using is called Get Better Faster, which is something that I'm familiar with when I was a principal as well. It's a great book to help new and novice teachers grow fast. So they like have like kind of a framework with which they implement it in their district, and they attached their framework to the tool, and they informed the tool to say, hey, like, use it, be a coach to our instructional coaches who are looking for like what the right next step is to give to a teacher based on their classroom observations. So the instructional coaches themselves can use this tool as a resource to ask like, hey, I just observed this in a classroom. What would be the appropriate next step in the Get Better Faster framework? Right. And now I can give a really thoughtful, actionable next step without having to memorize that framework, and in context of what actually happened in the classroom, which so MagicSchool just transformed into an instructional coaching tool, right? And it through that customization, which I think is like one of the more inspiring things as people start building their own thoughtful use cases. I think that we're going to see more and more of those kinds of things that we built this so you could have a playground, and now they're starting to imagine whole new ways to implement it.
Yeah, it's a great example. And the retrieval augmentation generation is a really interesting technique for education, because as you said, you can take an entire set of standards, an entire philosophy, all the papers about project-based learning, a whole book about instructional, technique, and just sort of bounce off of it and say, we already do this, but use this framework or use this research or use these standards, and it can just augment incredibly and basically in real time. So, the other. So Ben, I want to talk to you about, you use obviously pedagogy is sort of at the center of what you do. You're about identifying misconceptions. You're about mathematics. One of the things that Bethanie mentioned was this idea of AI can assess the actual process In the map, we call this assessing process over product, right? See what notes they're putting in the margins or how people are talking about a problem as they're solving it or how they're making sense of it. This is the kind of thing we've never really been able to do at scale in the past. I mean, an individual tutor can watch a student and say, I'm going to tell me exactly what you're doing. Think aloud. I'm going to look exactly at every step of your problem and I'll tell you where where you might go off. But we've never been able to do it, at scale. Tell us about what Eedi is doing with pedagogy in a topic, math causes enormous anxiety. It has there's so much room to grow in terms of the pedagogy. How do you make sure that you're building a pedagogically sound tool and not, and just really making the most of what we already know and learning more as you go?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of some interesting bits to touch on this. One is like we don't get this right all the time, not just us generally, but there's been some examples previously of concepts that have undermined learning. So example one, personalized learning. It was the big thing about a decade ago, 15 years ago, and I think there's evidence that it's kind of inadvertently increased the achievement gap because there's been this focus on engagement, i.e., if you've got a 10-question quiz, you want like kids to get 7 of those questions right, which means that for your low achievers, you're going to ask them easier questions than your high achievers. So you're kind of broadening this gap. I think Stacey Maples at Wested's got a really interesting paper which kind of got lost in the pandemic about this kind of assumption that maybe that's actually what's happened. I think the second example actually touched on the process versus the product. So homework help solutions that have existed for a while as well, be it smartphone and a photo or knowledge sharing communities. Another eminent UK educator, Daisy Christodoulou, she talks about what matters is not the product, but the process. If it were the product, these homework tools would be fine. Here's the answer, done. But it's the process. So the student has to require to understand the work, what the work represents, and then the thinking that kind of went into it. So it's not good enough that they just receive the answer. And sometimes, like generative AI, certainly early on, and it's still, I think, the case, has struggled with that alongside the hallucinations. But I think there's being advances being made. Arena from, I forget her surname, sorry, but who's the research lead at Google DeepMind, has already talked about how they're thinking about their model in a pedagogical sense. So thinking about some of those kind of processes that a teacher might go through, like we've touched on some of them, things like retrieval or prerequisite knowledge and things like that. But I think one of the other areas that we're acutely interested in is you could build the best AI tutor in the world, but it's still going to be as dumb as a human tutor in that cold start problem. It knows nothing about the student. So how do you provide that intelligence to the AI tutor about perhaps what does that student have that prerequisite knowledge? Should they be accessing the problem they've got right now? What did they learn the last time they came to the solution? And as a consequence of that, do they have the prerequisite knowledge? And actually, maybe you can ask an additional question which touches on retrieval. But I think some of the things that we've kind of done well is we've always got teachers involved. Like a huge proportion of Eedi's team are domain experts, maths teachers. I think I mentioned in the chat, I think to middle and stuff is that, one of the 3 co-founders is Craig Barton. He's like the Doug Lemov of the UK. And we're collaborating with schools constantly to ensure that the tools that we're building are there to be used by the people that need them. I think tech is often guilty of creating solutions in education where a problem doesn't necessarily exist. But I think one of the other things that we're really fortunate to have, I think, like a deal in that space as well, is like we've got a large user base and we have a learning science team and we run experiments all the time. Ethically, I should add, but we run experiments all the time. And because what we're trying to do is find that balance between pedagogy and engagement. We've tried some experience around student agency, giving student choice. And what you see is this lovely graph where there are 4 paths that they can go down and they kind of start off. And then the kids kind of realize, oh, hang on, I can achieve what I want to achieve through this route. And then what you see is this one thing just spike because they work that out. So these kind of experiments are always going. And again, to Adeel's point, like transparency is key for us. You can go to, I think Eedi.com/research. There's huge amounts of data that you can download on some of the misconceptions. There's experiments that we've run. These are data sets that people can use to experiment with. And I think we've had something like 3,500 papers written using these data sets as well. So I think like this is a real big part of what we do. Does pedagogy work? Here's data to prove it.
Yeah, and you're touching on something I think is so exciting, which is that we have, decades of educational research, most of which was done in education schools and colleges, in research universities. But suddenly we have this data and these real-time interactions happening at scale, and there's a new whole generation of research that is happening right now based on these AI tools. We're going to discover things I think we've never known before about how people learn. And I'm really glad you're bringing up the double-edged sword of some of these pedagogical techniques. We think they're going to work. Sometimes they backfire. So it's really important to actually monitor how it pans out in real time, rather than just assuming that because it's based on prior research, it's going to work. Really, really interesting. And so we're coming on our last topic. I want to have a little bit of time for audience questions. So please, if you have questions, put them in the chat now. We're probably only going to get to a few of them. We're going to talk until 10 of the hour for this next topic, and then we'll probably take 3 audience questions or so. But please put your questions in the chat. Sarah will help facilitate those. So let's talk about educators and AI. One of the things that came up a lot in making this map is that you have all of these direct-to-consumer tools, including the homework help solutions that were just mentioned. That Photomath was sort of the granddaddy of these, but there's many homework help tools. Students are doing them all over the place. They're using tools to write drafts of essays, to write essays, to do all sorts of things. There's a whole integrity question we're not going to get into too much today, but it's really interesting how there's this sort of informal education world with AI and this formal education world in AI. And the formal education world, I think, is changing and sort of swinging back and forth very quickly. Adeel, you mentioned how there was sort of this first reaction where all these big districts banned AI, wholesale. Then they've tried to embrace it, and now they're trying to sort of find this middle ground. You have been at the front lines of this since the beginning. You're one of the very largest tool suites. We call it a tool suite for teachers and learners. And you've been at the front lines. You've seen people's fears, you've seen the pushback, you've seen the gut reactions and the embraces. Can you give us, just for all the people listening, a little bit of an overview of being in schools during this entire Gen AI era? Have you seen sort of there be changes in how people think about the incredible power of AI versus the sort of fears and some of the nervousness that people have felt over the last couple of years?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I actually think of this in I think of it as a spectrum of adoption that is happening. And actually every school and district and region of the country and the world, I think, is experiencing their own path on that spectrum. So, there are folks that we still talk to today that have still banned AI tools. And they're few and far between, especially for educators these days. Like, that's changed a lot in the broad sense that most schools and districts, especially in the US, have become much more comfortable for educators using AI. But there are still folks on the end of the spectrum, and nope, we still ban everything. So just like that's one end of the spectrum. Then there's, I think, what the mainstream is right now is that we're really comfortable with this for educators, and we see a lot of really valuable use cases for educators to use. We're not sure how to wrap our heads around this yet, or like how we're going to create a strategy for our district, but we're not going to stop educators from using tools like MagicSchool or ChatGPT or whatever. And we're kind of surveying these tools and thinking about it. Then there are folks who are like, we are gung-ho and we are really, really embracing this technology. And we are vetting tools like MagicSchool and others and deciding whether or not this is something we want to adopt as a school district for our school. And then I would say on the other end of the final end of the spectrum is like, we believe that like this must be something that is used with students because it is preparing students for the future workforce where AI will be inextricably connected to that future workforce. And we're starting to believe that maybe this can help us drive outcomes in schools, to Ben's case, of like, we think that maybe we can teach students better and we can drive some outcomes. So those are like on the progressive end of what I would say the spectrum looks like right now. And we have partners who use MagicSchool and like, are customers of ours, and they they actively turn off Magic Student, like the student product. They
Right.
say, we're here for Magic School, we're uncomfortable with our educators, but we're not ready for Magic Student yet. And usually what those cases are is like, we're not ready for it yet. It means that we will do it, but we first want to have our educators understand how to use this technology, get comfortable with it themselves before we launch a student product into our world. So we feel like safer and much more prepared for it. But I think that's actually been our thesis as well, is like, it's going to be really difficult for an educator to use AI with their students productively if they've never used generative AI themselves and understood like its practical value and limitations and those kinds of things. So that spectrum is one that like we kind of believe in as well, is like, let's start with the educators and then bring the students, especially in K-12 schools. But I think that for in terms of like prediction and where we're heading, there are more folks who are transitioning into this. We kind of have to embrace this. And the folks who are in leadership positions in technology, superintendents even, these are folks who've seen many technological revolutions in their lives now. So when I have conversations with district leaders, they'll volunteer to me things like, look, I saw this happen with, people panicking over the internet and access to knowledge. I saw this happen with cell phones. I saw this happen with so many different technologies, and we don't want to be caught behind this time. I was a teacher when, the professional world was using laptop computers for decades before we had them have one-to-one laptops in schools, and students kind of as a prerequisite of graduating high school should be able to send an email and like use a computer and type on a keyboard. And it took the pandemic to get one-to-one laptops to kids, right? So like, schools and districts have these acute memories of when we were behind on technology adoption, we hurt our students' chances in the future. And a lot of schools and districts are, hey, we want to do this responsibly. We want to make sure that this is like safe and thoughtfully done, but we know this is coming, and we want to start thinking about this more seriously. So I think everyone is pushing across this adoption spectrum in phases, but it bends toward progress.
Fascinating. Yeah. So Ben, just building on that, how have you seen the adoption spectrum for Eedi? Eedi has a somewhat different model of how it gets into schools, but it's used by over 160,000 teachers. You're in almost 20,000 schools, maybe more by now. So you've also seen many different reactions to AI, and you have also have a front row seat to in Europe, where they have all sorts of different data privacy, concerns. Tell us about how you've seen that this sort of spectrum from your perspective with a somewhat different kind of different tool that you're offering.
Yes, I'll start by just saying, actually, I think the UK and Europe and actually the rest of the world are quite different to the US. Like the one-to-one devices and things like that just doesn't exist. Like a UK teacher might need to book time in an IT lab, once a fortnight to actually get kids to sit in front of a laptop and stuff. So I think there's that kind of difference as well. I think the US is kind of on its own as a kind of example, but I think for us, like where we've succeeded is like first and foremost communication is key, and that communication has to come from a trusted source. For us, that's our co-founder, Craig Barton, as I mentioned, ex-teacher. He's a best-selling author and thought leader in this space. His books are around the research and pedagogy that exists and how he's used that in that classroom setting. And so I think that's kind of the first one. I think the second point, which like I think we've kind of navigated and stuff, there are some really extreme views in education, be it AI, pedagogy, like a myriad of other topics. And those scale of the opinions are vast. Like at one end, particularly with regards to AI, there are people who love it. And at the other end, there are people who just generally hate it. And like I think what we've tried to do is find that balance, like communicating practical terms, which I think is what MagicSchool does really well, of augmenting teacher practices rather than replacing them. I think sort of having in the back of my mind, teachers aren't looking for AI, they're looking for a solution. If AI happens to be a part of that solution, then cool. But I think that sort of leads to the final point, which is evidence. And like this for us is like the most important thing. We spend a lot of time building evidence around things that we do. We've been fortunate that we've had grant funding from various sources, even as a for-profit over the last decade, that have given us that flexibility to think about evidence. Like we run RCTs, it's that gold standard, but like very few startups can afford to do that. Like the time pressures involved, the complexities. Like quite often when you're at your earlier stages, your product's just not right. Yeah, so you're kind of building on the fly whilst trying to run one of these large scale trials. But then what we revert to too often is like this quantitative versus qualitative feedback, which can be misleading. You know, what's the sample size? You know, it's based on an internal poll rather than an independent evaluator, you know, speaking to your audience and things like that. But I think we've also made the job of teachers impossible as well. There's been a proliferation of tools, and I think like your market map's a really good example, like the difference between your first one and this one and probably the next one. And educators struggle to know like what works and what doesn't, and it's difficult to create that cut through. And I think we should help them. But I've had this discussion at various conferences in the past: is where does that responsibility lie? And I think one of the arguments I've made is where I think this is where philanthropic cash can really help the market, is providing that resource and time for products that show promise to kind of get some of that gold standard RCT evidence behind them, and communicate that to teachers.
Yeah, I'm really glad you're bringing that up. You know, it's such a new field that the research is there's some promising research starting to come out. You've been doing research for quite a number of years on Eedi and its effectiveness. But it's something that I think the entire edtech sector struggles with the efficacy conversation. And as you say, whose responsibility it is to really prove efficacy? Is it on the companies? Should it be on the government? Should it be on the philanthropic side? So I appreciate you bringing that in, and I know you have a sort of unique story about how that actually works. People should follow up and look into how Eedi has done this. It's really, really interesting. Bethanie, last question for you. And I'm, you know, I was going to ask about integrity, but I actually really don't want to. I hate the integrity question. Even though when you actually look at the tools, there's lots of homework help, there's lots of integrity, but that's not what interests me right now. I think that's a sort of flash in the pan personally. What I'd like to ask you about is you serve people even beyond the classroom. You have parents as one of the end users for Atypical. You have publishers, even employers. So you play a different role in the ecosystem where you're trying to sort of put lots of different players in education together using AI. Tell us about how you're doing that and what you see as the role of these sort of what some people consider, you know, extraneous players like employers in K-12 education.
Oof, I'm not prepped for this. I had like such a succinct response to the one that you were going to ask. What do I think the role is? Look, I think I'm going to try to be brief. I mean, fundamentally, you just have to realize that there are these other AI social platforms where people are communicating very broadly and giving all their information, and they're highly integrated. And if we keep on kind of having our heads in the sand and pretending like that's not happening, we're not going to get the right to kind of play in people's lives. Now, you know, I think we need to move to a user model where people like own and control their data in a much more real way. And I think there's like a role for philanthropy there. But fundamentally, nobody right now is creating a model where there's enough control by the end user and enough like high functioning technology that it like meets the needs of the market. It's tough. I'm going to stop there because I know you want at least 5 minutes to like have questions.
Yes, but that's really interesting. And you mentioned orchestration, and I think that's clearly core to how you're thinking about things. How do you create an ecosystem where lots of educational players can work together and it's not an overwhelm? Sarah, we have such incredible people in this room. Let's pull a couple of questions out of here. So question from Stuart Drexler. Hi, Stuart. How is AI being used to help teachers embrace student-led inquiry? Scaffolding a pedagogical change in which students actually take agency, they actually are in control, versus a little more of a, you know, guide, you know, sage on the stage model that we've had in education for a long time. Great question. Does one of our panelists want to jump in on that, the idea of student agency and students really leading their own educational journey? I will cold call. I will call on you.
I'm happy to share like a little bit of like, since I already talked about the writing feedback tool in MagicSchool, I'll kind of riff off that a little bit. You know,
Please.
the student experience of that writing feedback tool is they put their essays in to get feedback from their teachers, AI tool that they created. You know, they get areas of strength and areas of growth and some feedback on their writing mechanics aligned to what they wrote. And, you know, it's pretty specific. But, you know, one of the things that we have seen and teachers love about it is that you can continue the conversation about the feedback within the platform. So you can, after you get those areas to grow, where it says, you know, you kind of have a lot of run-on sentences in this essay, and, you know, improve them by doing X. You know, the student might say, like, I'm not even sure what a run-on sentence is. Can you show me an example in my essay?
Right.
Or, you know, this is a term I'm not familiar with. And we've had teachers tell us that like that non-judgmental kind of feedback that the AI gives is like a real superpower for them, because there are students in their classroom who, like, when they sit next to them to give them feedback, or they circulate their classroom to give them support, like there's a little bit of like maybe secondhand embarrassment because the teacher has to help me, who like the student might push away in the moment because the teacher's helping, but they're more apt to maybe ask the AI because it's private in MagicSchool. And it's like exciting to see how, you know, when human and AI are working together, how that can be really powerful, and how in the question specifically, that student is now taking agency of their learning. They, you do want to understand how they can make their essay better, and they'll ask even more questions about it than just getting the rote feedback. And I think there's those kinds of opportunities will continue with this the question answer nature of, you know, prompting and LLM responses.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I encourage people to look at the student support map. I don't mean to keep tooting the maps horn, but just in researching all the tools available to students, there is unbelievable stuff that sort of, especially at the higher ed level, which is now coming down into the K-12 level, of students, learners being able to just take huge control, measure their own progress, convert things into the media they want to work in, convert things into podcasts, could listen to academic papers as podcasts on the subway. Really weird, interesting things that are out there now. Question about data. This will be our last one. Considering the data is an integral part of AI, right? We've talked about it. How do you all plan to work with or around student data protection laws? You've all mentioned this a little bit, but that the commenter says so many amazing websites have been banned due to this. You know, do you see things? You know, do you see I guess I would expand. Do you see a change in the data protection laws? Are they going to get tighter in response to AI, or will they sort of say, wait, this AI is so powerful, our data laws are actually keeping innovation from happening? Ben, I know you think a lot about data. Let me start with you there. And Bethany, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I'll keep us brief. As a European company, with like GDPR has been in for a while now, but I think you can already see both in the UK, in Europe, and in the States, the laws are changing because of generative AI. Legislations come in, or advice has come in the UK, which explicitly says that, you know, you can't use student data in generative AI models, and so that's you know, difficult for people to contend with. I think where we specialize is trying to remove the PII from the data, particularly from that research perspective. So that's like, yeah, I think that's kind of how we would do it.
Yeah, so you anticipate they're not going to get easier. You have to work with them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bethany, how about you?
It's a tough one. You know, I'd argue that Europe is falling behind because like some of the most interesting cutting edge AI just like can't get launched there, and that's going to have long-term effects on students and companies, etc. You know, that said, there's also been some really horrific data breaches, which is understandably putting everybody on edge. So I think the oversight basically needs to change. I think we all need to admit that the cat's out of the bag. Users are using AI and putting all their PII in there, and we should be focusing on allowing users to do what they're doing everywhere else in educational systems where there's some learning benefit. So, you know, yeah. Otherwise, Snap AI and these other places are going to end up being the tutors, and there isn't great oversight in these companies.
That's a really interesting point. Bethany, let me just double down. You said you had a really pithy answer. The question I was originally going to ask Bethany was about how in the research there's so many homework helpers, some incredibly hugely popular apps that just solve problems for you, and then some of the academic integrity tools are incredibly popular. Some of these are much more popular than almost any other subject. What was your, so how do we get beyond
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
arms race mentality.
Totally. I mean, the bottom line, I think we need to like legalize cheating. Like we got to bring it out of the shadows and just let AI, help us be like, people are always going to do this. Now let's turn cheating into like a teaching moment
Mhm.
and make it a part of our pedagogy. That said, there's always going to be a need and a place for creating sustained focus, and that's something that teachers can uniquely do in person. So we shouldn't ever, we should always make sure that there's unaided learning, there's no technology, and that there's like really sophisticated use where we're not denying the realities of how people kind of are using the systems.
That is a pithy answer, and I like that a lot. I think that's where the internet sort of went. All these schools that ban phones in schools, and then kids go home and they are expected to use 100 different sites and tools for their homework. Thank you all for being here. This has been a really interesting conversation. I see a lot of amazing familiar faces in here and all sorts of people from all over. I'm seeing some comments about, hey, you left me off the map. Please send your suggestions through the suggestion form on the site. That's the easiest way to make sure you are on our radar and we can amplify your work. Thank you all for being here, and thank our amazing panelists. They're really doing fantastic work. Obviously, very thoughtful work in this very complex and fast-moving space. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day and week.